Hey everybody, and welcome back to the History Reader. In today's video we are doing the second part of the read-along for E.H. Carr's What is History? So in this video we're going to do chapters 3 and chapter 4. In the first video, which is the last one on my channel, we did chapters 1 and 2. So if you do want to watch that, then go ahead and watch them. If not, then we'll get right into it. So chapter 3 was titled History, Science and Morality, and in my opinion this was the weakest chapter so far. It's basically very philosophical. He's trying to defend history as a science, and it doesn't necessarily have that many practical applications for how we can think about reading and writing history. But it was fairly interesting. I just don't think it was as interesting as the first couple of chapters, or even chapter 4, which we'll talk about in a minute. So basically he deals with 5 points over this, which are like the 5 points that he hears most often about why history isn't a science, and then he goes through and presents his argument for why that point is incorrect. So the 5 points are that: number 1, history deals exclusively with the unique, science with the general. Number 2, that history teaches no lessons. Number 3 is that history is unable to predict. Number 4 is that history is necessarily subjective, since man is observing himself. And number 5 is that history is involved in issues of religion and mortality. Sorry, not mortality, and morality. I've miswritten that. So what are his arguments to this, or his answers to it? So for the first one, that history deals exclusively with the unique and not with the general, which science does, is actually, I think, his strongest point out of all of these 5. The argument against history being a science is that you're just looking at these discrete events through time and writing about them, and without being able to create generalizable knowledge from it, you can't call it a science. Carr argues that actually the job of a historian is to make generalizations, and in particular that the historian is interested in what is general about each unique event. So what can we pull out from events in history and make generalizations about? One of the obvious examples he gives is that we have this concept of war in history, and even though every war is very unique, there are generalizations that we can make about it. And so it is perfectly legitimate for a historian of the First World War to use knowledge of the Peloponnesian Wars to inform how he approaches the First World War, if that makes sense. So you're taking the general ideas and lessons and whatnot, and this is getting on to other points, but you're taking the general from the unique. And he says that that's actually the job of the historian. And then he says that the unique and the general in history have a similar relationship to facts and interpretation. So the unique really is the facts. So you have all these unique events, and you interpret those events, you place an interpretation on those events to create a general understanding. So that's the first point. The second point is that history teaches no lessons. And as I've kind of alluded to already, Carr argues that yes, because we create these generalizations, there are actually lessons in history. And he pulls examples from history to show that people who have studied history do act in particular ways because of what they have learned. So for example, the participants of the Russian Revolution having studied the French Revolution and knowing that that ended up with Napoleon, acted in certain ways. They excluded Trotsky, they pushed Trotsky out because they saw him as most likely to be the Napoleon figure. Number 3 is that history is unable to predict. And of course this is true, you can't predict exactly what is going to happen in the future, even if you have a perfect knowledge of history. But Carr basically argues that neither can science. Science can't predict exactly what is going to happen. They can only say that with these things being present, something will happen. So if you drop a ball from a particular height, it will hit the ground after a certain number of seconds, certain things being equal, and that can't take into account the fact that someone might catch the ball before it hits the ground. That's basically Carr's argument here, is that science deals with tendencies, not actual predictions. And so the fact that history can't predict anything doesn't mean that it's not a science. I found this a little bit pedantic, but that's what he was doing. I feel like he's giving this lecture in a particular time period, and there's a reason why he deals with the argument in the way that he does. Then we look at point number 4, which is that history is necessarily subjective since man is observing himself. And here the Carr argues that while yes, it is subjective, that doesn't mean that history can't be considered a science. It's just because there's a relationship between the observer and the observed, and that just needs to be taken into account when you're making those observations in history. And then he also uses the example of modern physics, like quantum mechanics, there being that relationship between the observer and the observed anyway, and nobody questions whether physics is a science. So again, I think this is a little bit tenuous and a little bit pedantic, but there's context here. And the last one is that history is involved in issues of religion and morality. And again, I think this argument that he makes is fairly odd. He basically says that, yes, while you are dealing with these issues of religion and morality while you're writing about history, it doesn't exclude it from being a science, because you're not placing judgments on things. You are writing about history and contrasting the way things happen and the values that people have, and it's all relativistic. This is getting into the philosophy part of it, which is not that useful. I mean, it's interesting stuff to read and think about, but it's not really that useful, particularly in the context of trying to understand history a bit better. So I won't spend too long on that. So that's chapter 3. Chapter 4 is on causation in history, and I actually found this chapter really interesting because it dealt with some of the practical aspects of how you approach certain things in history. It is a fundamental thing in history that we look at why things happened, and it's quite interesting the way he approaches this, because he says that there are myriad causes for everything that happens, and it's the historian's job to determine which of those causes are actually important, which of them are relevant, which of them are more or less important than other causes, and then to order them like that. So I thought this was a really interesting chapter, because it gives kind of practical advice. So he uses it towards the end of the chapter. He uses this sort of thought experiment. He lays out a situation where you have a drunk driver who goes around the corner and there's someone crossing the road, and their brakes fail. They hit the person crossing the road and the person dies. So then it is the job of the investigators in this case, but if you apply this analogy to history, it's the job of the historian to determine what was the cause of that person's death. The person, he adds here, was crossing the road because they were heading to the shops to buy cigarettes, but you could change this out. He was going to the shops to buy food or whatever. He was going somewhere to do something. And pretty quickly we can say that, well, the fact that that person smoked cigarettes is not a cause of their death in this case. Even though if they didn't smoke cigarettes, they probably wouldn't be going to the shops at that time and they wouldn't have died. So even though it is a cause, it's not the relevant cause to us and we can exclude it. The cause, quite obviously, is either the fact that the driver was drunk or the fact that the brakes failed. And when you delve into why we can make this determination of which one is the cause and which one we can just exclude and ignore, it comes down to the fact that there is an end we're trying to get to. We're trying to figure out what was the cause here because we want to avoid it happening in the future. And banning cigarettes is very, very unlikely to stop it happening in the future. So when you're looking at something like the Russian Revolution, for example, we have selected the causes that were relevant and excluded ones that weren't. So for example, the fact that there's a story of Lenin on the night of the revolution going through St. Petersburg in disguise and he doesn't get noticed. So is that a cause of the revolution? Because if he had got caught, the revolution maybe wouldn't have happened. But you can't really say it's a cause because there isn't a generalization that you can make out of that. And that's the point. It goes back to the previous chapter that we're trying to get these generalizations out of history. And so the causes of the Russian Revolution, if that's what you're looking at, needs to be something you can generalize to other revolutions. And so that's the really interesting part here. He then deals with two other things in the chapter. The first is the idea of determinism. Can historians say that something is inevitable? And should a historian write their history as if something is inevitable? And Carr says that obviously we can't say that something was inevitable. Same thing as when you drop a ball from a certain height, you can't tell 100% for sure that it's going to hit the ground because someone could come out and catch it, right? But he also says that to write a history, ignoring the fact that the outcome was the outcome and then exploring all the different what-ifs is bad history, that we shouldn't write like that. Because you're going to go off on tangents and you're not going to pull out the real valuable information if you do that. So that's his argument on determinism. He says that someone who writes a history of the American Revolution without going down all these tangents of what might have happened if this had changed or that had changed isn't writing bad history and are not falling into determinism. And the final thing is the role of chance or accident in history, and how should we deal with that? Because quite clearly accidents happen in history and that changes the course of history in some cases. In a lot of cases it does. And how do we deal with that? Because you can't generalize that accidents happening. So it's kind of in a way not useful to us. But you can generalize. But Carr says that we shouldn't ignore it because it is relevant to the thing that we're studying. But we should acknowledge that it was an accident or it was by chance that this happened, and that therefore you can't count on the person in this position in a revolutionary government dying prematurely, for example. That's not a rule that you can pull out or a generalization that you can pull out. It is just an accident. You should treat it that way, but not try to just push it out of the story because it was an accident. So that was everything from chapter 3 and 4. I hope you enjoyed it, found it useful. Please let me know your thoughts on the chapter below. If you're enjoying the videos on the channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.